The morning Pearl Talbot walked into the wrong funeral. She was already carrying grief so heavy it had carved hollows beneath her eyes and made her hands tremble against the small purse she clutched at her waist. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, sat baking beneath a sun that showed no mercy to the living or the dead. Dust devils spun lazy circles in the main street, and the smell of sage and dry earth hung over everything like a second sky. Pearl had ridden the stagecoach from Caldwell, Kansas for 3 days, and her black mourning dress was creased beyond saving, her dark hair pinned up in a style that had once been careful but had unraveled somewhere around the Oklahoma border. She was 31 years old, not a young woman by the territory's harsh standards, but not old either. She was the kind of woman whose beauty had deepened with hardship, the way certain wood grains only emerge when the timber has been tested by weather. She had come to Harlow Creek to say goodbye to her cousin, Mabel Greer, who had written her one last letter before the consumption took hold entirely. Pearl had not been close enough to Mabel in years to claim genuine heartbreak, but she had loved the woman in the quiet way you love people who knew you before you became someone defined by loss. She had buried her husband, Thomas Talbot, 14 months prior, and since then she had been doing the necessary work of surviving selling their small farm in Caldwell, settling debts, figuring out the arithmetic of a life that had been built for two and now had to be restructured for one. She stepped down from the stagecoach onto Harlow Creek's main street, asked the driver where the church was, and received directions in a wind-roughened voice that pointed her east on Cottonwood Road. Pearl walked the half-mile without complaint, squinting against the dust, and when she saw the little white clapboard church with its modest bell tower and the small cluster of mourners gathering outside, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that grief always produced. She did not know any of these people. That was no surprise. She had never visited Mabel's new town. She smoothed her dress as best she could, composed her face into the appropriate expression of solemn dignity, and joined the cluster moving through the church's open doors. It was cool inside, as churches in those days managed to be even in October, the thick walls holding onto the memory of cooler nights. Pearl chose a pew near the back, folded her gloved hands in her lap, and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The flowers at the front were white chrysanthemums, which she thought was a nice choice, and the pine casket was polished to a warm honey color. The preacher, a short man with enormous side whiskers, was arranging his notes at the pulpit. She noticed the man sitting beside her only because he sat down rather heavily, as if his legs had simply given out beneath him. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been shaped by hard outdoor work, scarred across the knuckles, permanently tanned to a deep amber. He wore a black coat that was clean but not fashionable, the kind of coat a working man owned for exactly these occasions and wore as seldom as possible. His hat was in his hands, and he was turning it by the brim in slow, methodical circles, as if the motion kept him from doing something else entirely. His face, when Pearl glanced at it sideways, was a composition of barely contained devastation. He was perhaps 35 or 36, with a strong jaw darkened by the shadow of a beard he had not fully shaved, and his eyes, when they were still enough for her to see their color, were a deep gray-brown, like storm clouds trying to decide whether to rain. Pearl looked forward again. She did not want to intrude upon anyone's private grief. She understood perfectly well what it felt like to have a stranger observe your suffering, and she had no wish to do that to this man. The preacher cleared his throat. "We are gathered today to celebrate the life and mourn the passing of James Monroe, beloved father, rancher, and man of this community." Pearl went very still. James Monroe. She had come to say goodbye to Mabel Greer. The name on the announcement she had received, reread twice on the stagecoach, had been Mabel Greer, and yet the name of the deceased being honored in this church was most decidedly not Mabel Greer. Her mind worked quickly through the geometry of the situation. The driver had said east on Cottonwood Road. She had walked east on Cottonwood Road. She had found a church. It was a small town. It had not occurred to her, and perhaps should have, that a small town might have two churches, and that both might be holding funerals on the same morning in early October. She was in the wrong place. She should leave. The correct and sensible thing to do was to rise quietly, excuse herself, and find the correct church before the service for Mabel Greer began without her. And yet she did not move. The man beside her, this stranger with the turning hat and the stricken eyes, had drawn in a sharp, ragged breath at the first mention of his father's name. Pearl heard it the way you hear a sound in a quiet room that should not have been audible at all, and something in her chest responded to it with a recognition that had nothing to do with logic. She knew that sound. She had made that sound herself, in the front pew of the Presbyterian Church in Caldwell, Kansas, when the preacher said Thomas Talbot's name for the first time after the box was closed. She stayed. She told herself it was because leaving mid-service would be disruptive. She told herself the other funeral might already be underway, and she would only be interrupting that service too by arriving late. She told herself many practical things as the preacher began to speak about James Monroe's 40 years of ranching in Harlow Creek County, about his reputation for fairness with his neighbors and his firmness with his cattle, about the way he had built his land up from a quarter-section claim into something his son could be proud of. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. She stayed because the man beside her was suffering the specific, particular, bone-deep suffering of losing a parent, and she did not want him to suffer it alone. She did not know him. She did not need to know him. She simply understood the geography of his grief, and she was unwilling to abandon a fellow traveler in that country. The service was 40 minutes long. Pearl sat through all of it with her hands folded and her eyes forward, and when the congregation sang a hymn, it was "Abide With Me," played on a slightly out-of-tune upright piano by a woman with white hair and determined fingers. Pearl sang too, softly, because she knew the words and because singing was one of the things that helped. The man beside her did not sing. His hat had stopped turning in his hands, and he was holding it motionless in his lap as if it required the full application of his strength. When the pallbearers carried James Monroe's casket out into the October light for the graveside service, Pearl stood with everyone else and followed. She was not sure when exactly she had made the decision to see this through to its conclusion, but she had made it. She stood at the back of the gathered mourners in the small churchyard, where the grass was brown and the cottonwood trees were losing their leaves in small yellow flurries, and she bowed her head while the preacher read from the Psalms. She became aware that the man had positioned himself at the edge of the gathered group, slightly apart, as if he could not quite stand the proximity of other people but could not stand true isolation either. She understood that too. She moved without quite planning it to stand a few feet from him, close enough that he would know another person was there, far enough that she was not intruding. He glanced at her. It was a brief, sideways look, the kind a person gives when they suddenly notice something they had not expected to find. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked back at the casket, and she hoped that her expression communicated clearly what she intended, which was, "I see you, and I am not going anywhere, and you do not have to explain anything to me." When the final prayer was said and people began to disperse, some toward the church for the meal that always follows these occasions, some simply toward their horses and wagons and the ongoing business of their lives, the man turned to her. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, and the devastation in his face was mixed now with something like confusion. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said. His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that came from outdoor living and infrequent use in social situations. "I'm Roscoe Monroe. That was my father." Pearl felt the moment she had known was coming, the moment she would have to explain herself. She had been rehearsing something sensible and honest, and she delivered it as plainly as she could. "Pearl Talbot," she said, extending her hand in the firm way she had learned was necessary when you were a woman conducting business in the world alone. I came to Harlow Creek for a different funeral this morning, my cousin, Mabel Greer. I walked into the wrong church. I realized it about 4 minutes into the service. She paused. I stayed anyway. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Monroe. He stared at her for a moment. His gray-brown eyes moved over her face with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not suspicion exactly. It was more like the look a man gives when he has encountered something he did not know he was missing. You stayed through the whole thing, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes. Why? Pearl looked at the fresh-turned earth beside her cousin's casket, no, beside James Monroe's casket, and considered the question honestly. Because you looked like someone who needed another person in the room with them, even a stranger. Roscoe Monroe was quiet for a long moment. A dry October wind moved through the cottonwood trees, and the yellow leaves came down around them like something ceremonial. I appreciate that, he said finally, and his voice had gone lower and rougher in a way that told her he meant it far more than those 4 words could contain. You're welcome, Pearl said. And then, because she genuinely did not know the answer and thought it was important information, where is the other church? I should go find out about my cousin. He blinked as if returning from somewhere distant. That would be Reverend Walsh's church up on the north side of town, Birch Street. He looked at her for a moment. I can take you there if you'd like. I have my wagon. She could have declined. A sensible woman, a careful widow who was rebuilding her life on a foundation of practicality and caution, would have declined and found her own way. But Pearl Talbot had learned in the 14 months since Thomas's death that excessive caution could calcify into something that left you entirely alone in the world, and she was not certain she wanted that. There was something about this man's directness, the plain, unornamented way he spoke, the lack of any performance in his grief or his offer, that she found herself trusting without quite deciding to. Thank you, she said. I would appreciate that. They walked together through the churchyard toward the gate, and Pearl noticed the way several of the remaining mourners watched them with the particular alertness that small towns reserve for anything unexpected. She kept her chin level and her pace steady, because she was old enough to know that the watching eyes of a small community were neither malicious nor kind. They were simply eyes, doing what eyes do. Roscoe's wagon was a solid working vehicle, a flatbed with a spring seat, pulled by 2 well-matched bay horses that he called Pepper and Crane. He helped her up with a straightforward offer of his hand, no excessive ceremony, no condescension, and climbed up beside her, taking the reins in those broad, work-scarred hands. How long have you been widowed? He asked when they had left the churchyard behind and were moving up the unpaved street. Pearl looked at him sharply. He was watching the road ahead. My black dress, she said. Yes, and the way you sat in there, like someone who knows the territory. He paused. My wife passed 3 years ago. Eleanor, I recognized the look. Pearl let out a slow breath. The sky above Harlow Creek was an enormous blue, the kind of blue that only exists in Texas in the fall, and the cottonwood trees along the roadside were burning gold in the morning light. 14 months, she said. His name was Thomas. He was a farmer, a beat. Was Eleanor from here? Born here, Roscoe said. Daughter of the banker. Some people thought it was an unlikely match, her and a rancher. She didn't seem to think so. Something moved across his face, and Pearl recognized that too, the involuntary softening that came with a specific, beloved memory. She made the best dried apple pie I have ever eaten in my life, before or since. Thomas could fix anything, Pearl said without planning to. Broken axle, broken fence, broken window latch. He could look at something broken and just understand it. She found that her voice was steady, which was no longer something she had to work for. It had become simply true, the way the grief had become simply true. Constant and manageable, the way a low fever becomes something you carry without noticing until someone takes your temperature. You came a long way for a cousin you weren't especially close to, Roscoe observed, not unkindly. She was one of the last people who knew me before, Pearl said. Before I was widowed, before I was a woman living alone, before everything changed. I suppose I felt I owed her a proper goodbye for that. Roscoe nodded slowly. I understand that thinking. The North Church, Reverend Walsh's, on Birch Street, was a smaller building than the one she had inadvertently attended, with a lopsided steeple and a yard full of old oak trees. When Roscoe pulled the wagon to a stop outside it, Pearl could hear the faint sound of him singing from within. She had missed the service itself, it seemed. She felt a pang of guilt about that, though she was honest enough to examine it carefully. She had missed the service for a cousin she had not seen in 6 years, to attend the funeral of a stranger's father in its entirety. That was strange. It was perhaps inexplicable, and yet she found she did not regret it. "I'll go pay my respects to Mabel's family," she said, climbing down from the wagon with less grace than she would have preferred. "And then I suppose I need to find somewhere to stay in town." She straightened her dress. "The stagecoach back to Caldwell doesn't run until Saturday." It was Tuesday. Roscoe sat with the reins loose in his hands and looked at her with an expression that was deliberate and considered. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly so there's no misunderstanding about my intentions." Pearl met his eyes. "All right. You did something this morning that was genuinely kind. You didn't have to do it, and most people would not have done it. I am not," he stopped, began again. "I am not very good at accepting kindness from people I don't know. I'm not sure I'm very good at it even from people I do know. My father would have called that a character flaw, and he would have been right." He looked at the horses for a moment, then back at her. "I would like the opportunity to return the kindness, if you'll allow it. The town has a decent boarding house on Main Street. Mrs. Hatch runs it, and the meals are good. But I would also like to invite you to have supper at my ranch tonight, if that wouldn't be inappropriate. Just a meal. My housekeeper Clara will be there, so there's nothing improper about it." Pearl studied him for a moment. In 1882, a widow had a great deal to be careful about, and she was careful in general. But careful was different from afraid, and she had seen enough of this man in 2 hours to form a reasonably accurate assessment of his character. He was plain-spoken. He was not performing anything. He was grieving, and he was reaching out in the way that people reach out when they are afraid of drowning. "I'll accept the meal," she said, "but only because Clara will be there, and because I have not had a proper home-cooked supper in 3 days, and because you asked plainly enough that I believe you meant what you said." Something almost like a smile moved across his face. It was a brief and careful thing, but it was there. "6 o'clock," he said. "The Monroe Ranch is about 2 miles south of town on the Caldwell Road. You'll see the gate with the iron M. I'll see you at 6, Pearl said. And then she turned and walked up the path toward the little church with the lopsided steeple, to say a late and imperfect goodbye to her cousin Mabel Greer. The Monroe Ranch was exactly what Pearl had imagined when she thought about what a rancher's home should look like in the Texas Hill Country. It sat on a rise above a creek that was still running in October, which meant the land was well watered, and the main house was a long, low structure with a covered porch that ran its full length. The outbuildings were numerous and in good repair: barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that had been cleared for the season but showed evidence of serious cultivation. There were cattle visible in the far pasture, perhaps 100 head, red-end white Herefords that had become popular among Texas ranchers in recent years because they were hardy and efficient. Pearl drove herself out in the small rented buggy she had hired from the livery stable on Main Street, arriving at 6 o'clock precisely. She had changed into a dark blue dress, the best one she had brought, which was not her morning dress but was still appropriately subdued. She had repinned her hair with more care than she had managed that morning, and she had spent a few minutes sitting on the bed in Mrs. Hatch's boarding house, telling herself firmly that this was a meal, not a courtship, and that she was going because she was lonely and hungry and slightly curious about the man, and there was no shame in any of those things. Roscoe was on the porch when she arrived, as if he had been watching the road. He had changed too, a clean shirt, dark trousers, his boots brushed. He had shaved properly, which made his face look younger and revealed the clean lines of his jaw. He came down from the porch to take her horse's bridle while she climbed out of the buggy, which she appreciated, and he showed her up to the porch and held the door for her with a naturalness that suggested it was simply how he had been raised. The inside of the house was neat in the way that men's spaces are neat when they have been kept by a capable housekeeper, practical and ordered, but without feminine touches. There was a large stone fireplace in the main room, a long table of rough-hewn oak, a settee that had seen better days but was clean, and on the mantelpiece a small framed photograph, oval-shaped, of a woman with light hair and serious eyes. Pearl did not stare at it. She noticed it, acknowledged it in her peripheral vision, and let it be. Clara was a stout woman of 50 or so, with Mexican heritage evident in her coloring, and an expression that evaluated Pearl with frank and unapologetic interest for about 30 seconds before apparently reaching a positive conclusion. She set a supper on the table that Pearl had not expected. It was genuinely good cooking: roast beef with onions and peppers, biscuits, stewed tomatoes, and a dried apple pie that made Pearl catch her breath with a complicated emotion she did not fully understand until she was already seated. "He told me a leaner's recipe," Clara said, nodding at Roscoe without ceremony. "I thought it was a good night for it." Roscoe looked at Clara with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and mild exasperation, and Clara looked back at him with the calm authority of someone who has been managing another person's household for years and is not intimidated by their employer's feelings. Pearl looked at the pie and then at Roscoe. "That was a kind thought," she said. "Clara's kind," Roscoe said. "I just had the apple stores." They ate. The conversation began slowly, the way conversation between careful people always does: weather, cattle prices, the state of the Caldwell Road, the price of beef at the railhead in Abilene. But supper is a long meal, and Clara kept refilling the coffee, and somewhere between the main course and the pie, the conversation shifted into deeper water. Pearl told him about Thomas, about how they had met, about the farm in Caldwell, about the morning she had woken to find him on the floor of the barn where he had gone before dawn with what he had taken for indigestion, and what turned out to be his heart. She told it plainly, without reaching for effect, because she was a woman who had learned that plain truth had its own power and required no ornamentation. Roscoe listened. That was the thing she noticed first. He actually listened, in the full and present way that some people managed and many did not. He did not look at the table or out the window. He looked at her, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking about what she had said rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Alina had the fever," he said then. "2 years after we were married. It came fast. They said it sometimes does that summer fever. 1 week she was fine and the next she was gone." He looked at his hands. "We had been planning to have children. We had talked about it a great deal. She had names picked out." He stopped. Started again. "I told myself afterward that there was a mercy in it being fast. I have since concluded that I was lying to myself." "There's no mercy in it either way," Pearl said quietly, "just different kinds of hard." He looked at her then with a directness that was not uncomfortable but was very serious. "No, I suppose that's right. They had the apple pie." Clara, with what Pearl was beginning to understand was her characteristic tact, found reasons to be elsewhere for extended periods while remaining technically present in the house. And so Pearl and Roscoe sat at the long oak table with their coffee and their pie, and talked in the way that people sometimes talk when grief has stripped away the usual social carapace and left them capable of a directness that normal circumstances rarely produce. She learned that Roscoe was 36, that he had taken over the ranch gradually from his father over the last 10 years as James Monroe's health had declined, that he had a younger brother named Hank who had gone to California 2 years ago and was allegedly working in the mines there, that he had 4 ranch hands, 2 of whom had been with the Monroe operation for more than a decade, and that he genuinely loved the land he worked in a way that was not sentimental but physical. The way you love something your body has learned through hard repetition. He learned that Pearl was 31, that she had grown up in Missouri, that she had come to Kansas with Thomas as a young bride, and had found the flatness of the territory oppressive at first, and then beautiful in a way she had not expected, that she had no children, that she was a skilled seamstress who had supplemented their farm income by taking in work from the neighbors, and that she was currently in the position of deciding what to do with the rest of her life, which was a position she found simultaneously frightening and, in certain moments, quietly interesting. "You're thinking about not going back to Caldwell," Roscoe said. It was not quite a question. Pearl turned her coffee cup in her hands. "There isn't much to go back to. The farm is sold. I have a room at Mrs. Parsons' boarding house, but that's not a life. I've been thinking about going somewhere entirely new." She paused. "I hadn't decided where." The fire in the fireplace popped and settled. Outside, the Texas night had come down cool and full of stars, and Pearl could hear the distant, low music of cattle in the pasture. "I think you should stay in Harlow Creek for a few days," Roscoe said. He met her eyes with that direct, careful gaze. "Not because of anything beyond, I would like the company. My father died 4 days ago, and I have been conducting myself with what I believe is appropriate efficiency and composure, and I am growing extremely tired of it. You are someone I can speak to plainly. I don't meet many such people." Pearl considered him for a long moment. "Mrs. Hatch seems very nice," she said finally. Something shifted in his expression, relief perhaps. "She makes a decent breakfast," he said. "I know, because my father used to eat there when he came to town on business." "I'll stay until Friday," Pearl said. "I can wire Caldwell and let Mrs. Parsons know." "Friday," Roscoe agreed. When she drove back to town that night, with the October stars enormous above the flat Texas plain and the sound of coyotes somewhere off to the west, Pearl allowed herself to notice something she had been carefully not noticing for most of the evening. She liked him, not in the giddy, anxious way of a first encounter, but in the quieter, more settled way that she associated with things that had the potential to be genuinely real. He was a serious person. He was honest. He had suffered and had not become bitter about it, or at least had not fully become bitter, and that seemed to her like evidence of good character. She was getting ahead of herself. She knew that. She told herself so firmly twice, and then gave up and let herself simply like him for the ride back to town. She wired Caldwell the next morning, telling Mrs. Parsons she would return the following week. Then she walked down Main Street in the October sunshine, reacquainting herself with the geography of a small town that was not hers but felt, in some low and preliminary way, as if it might be capable of becoming so. Harlow Creek had been established in the 1860s and had grown steadily through the cattle drives and the railroad expansion of the 1870s into a respectable settlement of perhaps 800 people. It had 2 churches, as Pearl had now confirmed personally, a bank, a general store, a hardware store, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, a saloon that had a reputation for being the better regulated of the 2 in town, a livery stable, and Mrs. Hatch's boarding house. There was a school on the western edge of town that went through 8th grade, and a small newspaper called the Harlow Creek Gazette that came out on Thursdays. Pearl bought a Thursday Gazette and read it over coffee at the small diner next to the bank, and she was reading the notices section when a shadow fell across her table. "Mrs. Talbot." She looked up. The woman standing beside her was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now just shrewd, and she was wearing a dress that cost considerably more than anything else Pearl had seen in town. "I'm Agnes Hartwell," the woman said, with the air of someone who expects to be recognized. "My husband is Gerald Hartwell, he's the banker." "How do you do?" Pearl said pleasantly. Agnes Hartwell sat down across from her without being invited, which told Pearl a great deal about her. "I heard you sat through the Monroe service yesterday. By accident, apparently." She tilted her head. "And that Roscoe Monroe drove you to the Walsh Church afterward." Pearl set down her newspaper. "That's right. He had supper with you last night too, I understand." "I had supper at his home," Pearl said, keeping her voice even. "His housekeeper Clara was there throughout." She paused. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartwell, but I'm not sure what your interest is." Agnes Hartwell had the grace to look slightly abashed, though only slightly. "I've known Roscoe Monroe since he was a boy," she said. "His mother and I were friends. She passed when he was 14, and his father raised him alone after that. He's a good man." She met Pearl's eyes with an expression that was simultaneously protective and assessing. "He's had a hard few years." "I know," Pearl said. "He told me about a leaner." Something shifted in Agnes Hartwell's expression, not quite surprise, but something close to it. "He told you about a leaner?" "Over supper, yes." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, "He hasn't spoken about a leaner to most people in this town since she passed. Not in any detail. She seemed to be revising something." "Where are you from, Mrs. Talbot?" Pearl told her. Agnes asked a few more questions. Not quite as bluntly as her opening gambit had suggested, but not delicately either. And Pearl answered them honestly, because she had no reason to be otherwise, and because she suspected that Agnes Hartwell would detect evasion as easily as a bloodhound detected a trail. By the end of 15 minutes, Agnes Hartwell appeared to have completed her evaluation. "You seem like a sensible woman," she said, standing. "Harlow Creek could use more sensible women." A pause. "The general store, Mr. Finney's, has had a job posting up for 2 months. He needs someone who can keep accounts and manage the dry goods counter. His wife used to do it before she had the babies." Another pause. "Just information." She left before Pearl could respond to that, which was probably the intention. Pearl sat with her coffee and looked at the Gazette and thought about what it would mean to take a job in a town where she knew nobody, except a grieving rancher she had met at the wrong funeral and sat beside for 40 minutes and then shared one meal with. It was, objectively, a very thin thread. And yet there she was, thinking about it. She went to Finney's General Store that afternoon not to apply for anything, she told herself, but simply to look. The store was a comfortable establishment with the particular smell of all well-stocked general stores in that era: kerosene, dried goods, leather, and the faint sweetness of molasses and plug tobacco. Mr. Finney was a narrow, energetic man of 50 with ink-stained fingers and an immediately evident problem with the organization of his books, which Pearl could see from across the counter. They spoke for 20 minutes. Pearl explained her background, her experience with the farm accounts and her seamstress work, and her current undefined status. Mr. Finney offered her a position on the spot with a salary that was not lavish but was livable. She said she would think about it. She went back to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and had a very honest conversation with herself about what she was doing and why. The job was real. It was an actual opportunity. It existed independently of Roscoe Monroe and would be a valid reason to come to Harlow Creek regardless of any other consideration. She had been trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life, and here was something tangible to do with it. The fact that she wanted to see him again, that she had been thinking about the way the firelight had caught the angles of his face, about the specific quality of his attention when he listened, about the way he had said Alina's name with exactly the right combination of grief and steadiness. That was a separate matter entirely, and she was a grown woman of 31 who could distinguish between practical decisions and hopeful feelings. She could. She was reasonably confident she could. She told Mr. Finney the next morning that she would take the job, with a start date in 3 weeks to allow her to return to Caldwell and settle her affairs there properly. She told Roscoe that afternoon, when he arrived at Mrs. Hatch's boarding house with a straightforward excuse about needing to pick up supplies in town that neither of them believed entirely, and they sat on the boarding house's front porch in the October light and drank the tea that Mrs. Hatch brought without being asked, because Mrs. Hatch was a kind woman with excellent instincts. Roscoe absorbed the news in silence for a moment. "You took Finney's job," he said. "Yes." "You came to Harlow Creek to attend a funeral," he said, "and now you're staying." "People make unexpected decisions," Pearl said. "Life is full of them." He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that was careful and hopeful in equal measure, like a man examining a field after a long drought and seeing the first signs of something beginning to come back. "I'm glad," he said, simply, plainly, with no ornamentation. Pearl looked out at Harlow Creek's dusty Main Street, at the wagons and horses, and the way the afternoon sun fell on the false front buildings, and let herself feel the thing she had been carefully not naming since the wagon ride from the churchyard. "So am I," she said. Pearl returned to Caldwell the following Saturday on the stagecoach, exactly as planned, and spent 2 weeks doing the brisk and efficient work of disassembling her previous life. She gave notice to Mrs. Parsons. She collected the last of her belongings from the storage room where she had put them after selling the farm: a quilt her mother had made, Thomas's pocket watch, which she had decided to keep, a small watercolor of the Missouri River that she had painted herself when she was 18, and which had traveled with her through every change since. She said goodbye to the few people in Caldwell she genuinely cared about, Dr. and Mrs. Rydell, who had been kind to her after Thomas died, and Sarah Coombs, who had been her closest friend and who hugged her for a long time, and said she was making the right decision in a voice that meant she hoped Pearl was making the right decision. She exchanged letters with Roscoe during those 2 weeks. His letters were not flowery. They were practical and direct news about the ranch, the price of cattle, the first significant frost of the season, a brief report on the progress of repairing one of the fence lines along the north pasture. But at the end of each letter, in handwriting that had become less cramped as the correspondence continued, he wrote something personal. About his father, about what James Monroe had meant to the land, about the way he was discovering, now that the initial shock had passed, that he had things he wished he had said to the man while he had the chance. Pearl wrote back in the same register, practical at first, then warmer, her own handwriting loosening as if the pen had decided to be more honest than she was permitting herself to be in person. She wrote about Thomas in ways she had not allowed herself to articulate to anyone else. About the arithmetic of grief, the way it changed over 14 months. About the strange guilt of beginning to be happy again, as if happiness were a betrayal. Roscoe wrote back about that specifically. His response to that letter was the longest he had written, 2 full pages in a hand that was obviously not practiced at letter writing, but was working hard at it anyway. He said that he had felt the same guilt, after a leaner, when he had had his first genuinely good day. A day when he had ridden the north fence line in early morning, and felt the particular pleasure of the land and the horse beneath him and the big sky above, and had come back to the house happy, and had then felt terrible about being happy. He said he had eventually concluded, with what he acknowledged was limited philosophical sophistication, that the people you lost would not want you to be permanently unhappy, that they had loved you when you were alive and full, and they would presumably wish you that same aliveness still. Pearl read that paragraph 3 times on the morning it arrived, sitting at the table in Mrs. Parsons' boarding house with the Kansas winter beginning to press against the windows. And she cried a little, not from sadness exactly, but from the feeling of being understood in a place you had been carrying alone. She arrived in Harlow Creek on the 4th of November, 1882, on the same stagecoach line she had taken 6 weeks earlier, with a trunk and 2 carpet-bags, and the clear sense that this time she was arriving rather than merely visiting. Roscoe was at the stagecoach stop when she arrived. She had not expected that. She had thought he might send a note to Mrs. Hatch's, or perhaps come by the boarding house that evening. She had not expected him to simply be there, with his hat in his hand and his horses tied to the hitching post, watching the road with the particular stillness of a man who has been standing in one place for some time and is prepared to stand there longer if necessary. When he saw her step down from the stagecoach, he came forward immediately, not rushing but moving with purpose, and he took her trunk from the driver without being asked. He said, "Good journey," and she said, "Tolerable," and they looked at each other for a moment with the particular awareness of two people who have been corresponding honestly and are now face to face with the consequence of that honesty. "You came back," he said. It was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "I said I would," Pearl said. "People say things," he said. "They don't always follow through." "I do," Pearl said, and she meant it as information, not a promise, because it was simply true. She was a woman who followed through. Thomas had known that. She intended to be known for it here too. He drove her to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house and carried her trunk up the stairs and set it in her room, and said he would call for her on Saturday morning if she was willing, because he wanted to show her the ranch properly, not just the house but the land, the full extent of it. He said it in a tone that was careful and a little formal, as if he was conscious of the need for propriety and was navigating it with good faith. "Saturday morning," Pearl agreed. He nodded once and left, and Pearl unpacked her trunk and hung her dresses and set her mother's quilt on the bed and placed Thomas's pocket watch on the small bedside table, and looked around the room that was her home now, and felt the particular mixture of fear and possibility that belongs to genuine new beginnings. She started at Finney's General Store on Monday. Mr. Finney had not exaggerated the state of his accounts, and Pearl spent the first 2 days primarily in the back room with the ledgers, imposing an order on them that they badly needed. She was good at this kind of work. She had always been comfortable with numbers in a way that many women of her time and circumstance were not, because her father had been a school teacher who had not particularly noticed that she was a girl when it came to arithmetic. The counter work she also found satisfying. There was something grounding about the social rhythm of a general store, the steady stream of people, the particular mix of need and conversation, the way a small town's character was legible in what its residents came to buy and how they asked for it. She learned names quickly. She learned which families were struggling with what prices and which were comfortable. She was careful not to be drawn into gossip, but she listened well, and within a week she had a functional map of Harlow Creek's social landscape. Agnes Hartwell came in on Wednesday with an order of dry goods and stayed for 40 minutes longer than was strictly necessary, asking Pearl questions that were pointed but not unkind, and seemed primarily aimed at ensuring that Pearl was properly situated and not lonely. Pearl appreciated this more than she would have predicted. Agnes Hartwell was not a comfortable person in the way that Mrs. Hatch was comfortable. She had too many opinions and stated them too directly for that. But she was genuinely concerned for the people in her orbit, and Pearl recognized that as a form of love even when it expressed itself as interrogation. "Roscoe Monroe came into the bank yesterday," Agnes mentioned, as if it were an aside while inspecting a bolt of wool cloth. "Settled his father's estate accounts. Gerald said he looked better than he had in weeks." "I'm glad to hear it," Pearl said. "He asked about you," Agnes said, still examining the cloth. In what Gerald described as a carefully offhand way, Pearl folded a piece of calico with more precision than it required. "I hope Gerald told him I was well." Agnes set the cloth down and looked at Pearl with the frank, assessing gaze that Pearl had come to understand was simply her natural mode. "You're being very sensible about this," she said, and it sounded like both a compliment and a slight complaint. "I'm trying to be," Pearl said. "Sensible is good," Agnes said. "Overly cautious is something else." She paused. "He's been alone for 3 years, Mrs. Talbot, and he is not a man who does well alone, he just thinks he is." Pearl looked at her. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you advising me to pursue a man I've known for less than 2 months?" Agnes Hartwell picked up the wool cloth again. "I'm advising you not to let the habit of caution become a substitute for living," she said. "That's general advice, applicable to any number of situations." She set the cloth on the counter decisively. "I'll take 4 yards." Saturday came, and with it a clear, cold November morning that smelled of frost and dry grass. Roscoe arrived at Mrs. Hatch's at 9 o'clock with a horse saddled for Pearl, a gentle gray mare named Tuesday, alongside his own big bay gelding, Crane. Pearl had not ridden consistently since before Thomas died, but it came back to her the way physical skills do when they have been genuinely learned imperfectly at first, then increasingly naturally, until by the time they cleared the town limits and moved out into the open Texas country, she felt the rhythm of it returning properly. He showed her the ranch the way he had promised, all of it. They rode the fence lines along the north pasture first, where the repair work he had mentioned in his letters was visible in the bright new posts and wire. He showed her the creek that gave the town its name, Harlow Creek itself, running clear over limestone rocks in a depression between two gentle hills, and explained that this was why his father had chosen the land, because permanent water in that country was worth more than almost any other feature. They rode through the herd, and Roscoe talked about the cattle with a knowledge that was detailed and genuine, explaining the shift from Longhorns to Herefords that had been happening across Texas in the past decade, the economics of it, the better beef quality, the way the Hereford bulls changed the character of a mixed herd over 3 or 4 years. Pearl asked questions that were genuinely curious, and he answered them with a pleasure that was visible, the pleasure of a man who loves his subject and has not been asked about it seriously in some time. They stopped at noon on a rise above the creek and ate the lunch. Clara had packed sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, apples, a small bottle of cold coffee, and sat on the dry grass with the enormous Texas sky above them, and the land running away in every direction in shades of brown and gold. "My father bought this land in 1847, Roscoe said, unwrapping a sandwich. "He came from Virginia. He always said Virginia was beautiful, but he could breathe in Texas." He looked out at the horizon. "I know exactly what he meant. Virginia is the kind of beautiful that's comfortable and planned. This is something else." "My father's people came from back east too," Pearl said. "He used to say Missouri was the first place that felt like it had room to think." "There it is," Roscoe said. "Room, that's what it is." They were quiet for a while, which was one of the things Pearl had begun to appreciate about him specifically. He was comfortable with silence. He did not fill it anxiously or reflexively, and so silence with him was not emptiness, but something more like shared presence. It was a quality she had also loved in Thomas, that capacity for companionable quiet, and acknowledging that, she discovered, no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like continuity, a preference that had persisted, a knowledge of herself that had been forged in one good relationship and was now available to inform another. "Can I ask you something directly?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "What do you want? Not from this afternoon, not from this week. Generally. What do you want your life to look like?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I want the ranch to be what my father built it to be," he said. "That's the work. It's real work and I believe in it." He looked down at his sandwich, then back up. "Beyond that, I want the house to be alive again. That's the best way I can put it. Since Alina, it's been functional, clean because Clara is excellent, well supplied, but quiet in the wrong way." A pause. "I want children, I want a family. I know that's very plain to say to someone I've known for a short time, but you asked what I wanted and that's the honest answer." Pearl absorbed this. "I want those things too," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who performed indifference about things she genuinely felt, "I am trying to move at a sensible pace. I don't want either of us to confuse grief and loneliness for something more substantial. I think you understand that concern." "I do," Roscoe said, "and I think it's right to be careful." He met her eyes with that steady, gray-brown gaze. "But I also think what's happened in the last 6 weeks is not something that happens to me ordinarily. You sat through my father's funeral because I looked like someone who needed company. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that." Pearl felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "It seemed like the right thing to do," she said. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "For me. I don't know if you can understand this fully, but I had spent 4 days before that funeral trying to feel whatever it is you're supposed to feel in the right way, and it wasn't working. And then you sat down next to me, a complete stranger who had walked into the wrong church, and something about having another person there, someone with no stake in any of it, no obligation, No reason to be there except that they chose to be. I was able to feel it properly. He stopped. I am not saying this well. You're saying it fine, Pearl said quietly. I'm saying that you helped me grieve my father, he said, and I do not take that lightly. That's not loneliness talking, and it's not gratitude talking. It's something else. Pearl looked at the horizon, at the long, flat expanse of Texas running away from them toward a sky that was beginning to pile up with the blue-white clouds of afternoon, and she thought about Thomas and about Mabel Greer and about the wrongness that had turned right, the door that had been the wrong door and had opened into somewhere unexpected. Give me time, she said. Not an excessive amount of it, but time. As much as you need, Roscoe said. He said it with absolute steadiness, and she believed him. They rode back to the ranch house in the afternoon light, and Clara made coffee, and Pearl stayed until the sun was low and orange on the western hills before she rode Tuesday back into town. And when she handed the mare's reins to Roscoe at the edge of town, where he had said he would meet her to take the horse home, they stood together for a moment in the fading light before she said goodnight and walked back to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house, feeling more fully present in her own life than she had in a long time. The weeks that followed were a slow and purposeful courtship that neither of them named as such until they were already deep within it. Roscoe came to town every week, sometimes twice, and he found reasons, legitimate reasons, genuinely legitimate, to stop by Finney's store while Pearl was working. He had supper at Mrs. Hatch's one Thursday evening when Mrs. Hatch invited both of them, transparently and warmly, and they sat at the boarding house table with Mrs. Hatch's other two boarders, a traveling hardware salesman who came through monthly and a shy young schoolteacher named Miss Percy who had arrived in September, and the conversation was easy and various and felt natural. He brought her small things, in the understated way of men who are not comfortable with grand gestures. A jar of honey from the bees his father had kept, which Clara had extracted in October. A particularly fine piece of quartz he had found along the creek bank, which Pearl placed on the windowsill of her room at the boarding house. A copy of a novel, George Eliot's Middlemarch, which Pearl had mentioned once in a letter, that he had ordered from San Antonio through Finney's store, and presented with the slightly uncertain air of a man who was not sure if the gesture was too much or not enough. It was exactly right. Pearl read it for the second time and thought about him considerably while doing so. She cooked for him once, at Clara's generous invitation, Clara making herself thoroughly scarce for the afternoon, and they ate together at the long oak table by the fireplace, and the domesticity of it was so natural and right that Pearl sat with it afterward in the quiet of the evening, and understood that she was not confused about anything. She was not conflating grief and loneliness with real feeling. She was not performing recovery or rushing a process she was not ready for. She was simply, clearly, truly falling in love with Roscoe Monroe, in the steady, full-hearted way that she had once fallen in love with Thomas Talbot, and the two feelings were not identical because no two feelings are identical, and no two people are the same, but they had the same essential character, the character of something real. She told Sarah Coombs in a letter, because Sarah had been her closest friend for a decade and deserved to know. Sarah's response arrived in 2 weeks, breathlessly enthusiastic, and Pearl smiled over it for a good while before writing back to say that she was taking things properly and at an appropriate pace, and that Sarah should not start sewing anything. December came to Harlow Creek with cold nights and occasional ice on the creek, and the cattle moved closer to the windbreak cottonwoods along the north fence. Roscoe worked long days with his hands, as he always did when winter settled in, checking the herd, feeding where the grass was insufficient, repairing equipment for the spring. Pearl was at Finney's from 8 in the morning until 6 most days, and Mr. Finney had begun to rely on her accounts management so completely that she suspected he had quietly forgotten what the state of the books had been before she arrived. Christmas in a small town in 1882, Texas, had a specific character: religious first, then social, with the church services as the anchor and the community gatherings radiating outward from them. Both churches in Harlow Creek held Christmas Eve services, and Pearl attended Reverend Walsh's, where she had been going since settling in town, and sang the carols with full voice because she loved Christmas carols and had always sung them heartily regardless of who was listening. Roscoe sat beside her in the pew. It was the first time they had sat side by side in a church since the morning she had walked into the wrong one, and she was aware of it in a way that felt significant without being heavy. They sang together. He had a low, slightly rough baritone that was better than he apparently thought it was, and afterward they walked out into the cold Christmas Eve night with the rest of the congregation, and the stars over Texas were enormous and brilliant. "I remember the first time you sat beside me in a church," he said when they had walked a few steps clear of the main group. "You remember it too," Pearl said, "very clearly." She looked up at him. In the cold, clear air his breath made small clouds, and his eyes in the starlight were exactly the color she had come to think of as simply Roscoe's eyes, that particular gray-brown that changed with his mood and the light but was always recognizably itself. "I'm glad I walked into the wrong church," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Pearl," just her name, in the low, steady voice that she had come to understand carried his fullest feelings in the moments when he used it like that. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to know I have thought about it carefully, and I am not saying it precipitously, and I mean every word of it." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for some time. I am not confused about it, and I do not think it is grief or loneliness, and I have been careful to be certain before I said it. I love you." Pearl felt the words land in her chest with a weight and a warmth that she recognized as the real thing. She had known it was coming, had felt it approaching over weeks of suppers and letters and Saturday rides, but she had not known quite what it would feel like to hear it, and it felt like relief, like coming out of a long cold into a warm room, like the arithmetic of a life becoming possible again. "I love you too," she said. Simply, plainly, the way she said all important things. "I have for a while." He reached out and took her hand, her gloved hand, in his cold, bare one, and held it as they stood in the winter dark outside the church in Harlow Creek, Texas, on Christmas Eve 1882, and Pearl thought that this was one of those moments that the rest of a life is built around. He proposed in January, on a clear, cold afternoon when she came out to the ranch on Tuesday, and they rode the fence line together, and he stopped at the rise above the creek, and said what he had to say in exactly the plain, serious manner she had come to expect and love about him. He did not have a ring. He explained that directly, saying he had intended to get one from the jeweler in San Antonio, but that the more he thought about it, the more he thought Pearl should choose her own ring because she would be the one wearing it, which was so thoughtful and so practical and so completely him that she laughed with genuine delight before saying yes. She said yes standing on a frozen hill in Texas in January with a cold wind in her face and the Hereford cattle visible in the distance, and the man she loved watching her with those storm cloud eyes, full of something that she could only describe as wonder, as if he still found it remarkable that she was here, in his life, in this place where she had not been 6 months ago. They set the wedding for April, which gave them time for the practical arrangements, time for Roscoe's brother Hank to be written to in California and asked to come, time for Pearl to write to Sarah Coombs and confirm that yes, the sewing should now begin, time for the natural rhythm of an engagement to do what it did, which was to let two people settle into the idea of each other in the fullest possible way. Harlow Creek received the news with the specific enthusiasm of a small town that has been hoping for exactly this outcome since approximately the second week of November. Agnes Hartwell was openly pleased in the way she was openly everything, informing Pearl when she came into Finney's store that it was about time and that Gerald had said the same, which Pearl took as the compliment it was genuinely intended to be. Mrs. Hatch cried a little, quietly, over her morning coffee when Pearl told her, and then immediately began talking about what flowers would be available in April and whether the church could manage a proper reception. And Pearl let her plan because Mrs. Hatch's planning was a form of love, and she received it as such. Clara at the ranch said nothing for a long moment when Roscoe told her, and then she said in her calm and unhurried way that this was good, that it was right, and that she would teach Pearl the dried apple pie recipe, the full correct one, and Pearl felt the weight of what was being offered and said thank you with her whole heart. Hank Monroe arrived from California in March, 3 weeks ahead of the wedding, and turned out to be a smaller, louder, more animated version of his brother, with the same strong jaw and gray-brown eyes, but applied to a face that was always on the edge of a grin, rather than in the thoughtful stillness that characterized Roscoe. He came with a wife Pearl had not known about, a tall, cheerful woman named Dorothy who had grown up in Sacramento, and Pearl liked her immediately and unreservedly. Hank embraced his brother with the ferocity of two men who have not seen each other in 2 years and are not comfortable with displays of emotion, but are making an exception because the occasion demands it. And Pearl watched them and felt the warmth of it, the family that was reforming itself around this gathering. The wedding was on the 14th of April, 1883, in Reverend Walsh's church with the lopsided steeple and the old oak trees. Pearl wore a dress that she and Sarah Coombs had made together, working from a pattern from the 1880 Godey's Lady's Book, a deep ivory cotton with a fitted bodice and a small train, simpler than a city bride's gown but beautiful in its simplicity. Her hair was pinned with small white flowers that Dorothy Monroe had helped arrange that morning, and she carried a bouquet of bluebonnets that Roscoe had brought in from the south pasture where they grew wild along the limestone outcroppings. When she walked down the aisle, she did not look at the assembled congregation. Harlow Creek had turned out substantially, the church nearly full. She looked at Roscoe. He was standing at the front with Hank at his shoulder, and when she walked through the door he looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the performative expression of a man at a wedding. It was simply and completely love, present and full and undefended, the face of a man who is not pretending anything, whose heart is entirely visible. She held that expression in her eyes all the way down the aisle. The ceremony was simple and traditional, because they were both people who believed in the essential meaning of the words rather than elaborate ornament. They said their vows in clear, steady voices. When Roscoe put the ring on her finger, a ring they had chosen together from the San Antonio jeweler's catalog, a simple gold band with a small cluster of garnets that she had pointed to instantly and known was right. His hands were perfectly still, which she noticed because she knew what it meant from him. They signed the register, and Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife, and the congregation applauded in the warm, pleased way of people who have been rooting for an outcome and are genuinely delighted to see it arrive. The reception in the churchyard, because April in Texas is often warm and clear, and that day was festive and generous. Mrs. Hatch had organized the food, which meant it was excellent. Someone brought a fiddle and someone else had a mouth organ, and there was dancing on the packed earth in a way that was joyful and unsophisticated and entirely right for the occasion and the place. Agnes Hartwell danced with her husband Gerald, who turned out to be a more energetic dancer than his banker's gravity suggested, and Clara danced with the blacksmith, and Hank and Dorothy Monroe danced with the particular ease of people who do not care whether they are dancing correctly. Roscoe danced with Pearl twice slowly, carefully, with his large hand warm at her waist and her hand small in his, and the second time she put her cheek against his shoulder and felt the steady beat of him, the solid reality of this man who had been a stranger 6 months ago and was now her husband, and she thought with great clarity and no sorrow, Thomas would have wanted this. Thomas would have looked at this day and said, yes, this is right, this is the life continuing. She was sure of it. She had been sure of it for months. Later in the afternoon, when the dancing had quieted and people were drifting toward home in the long golden light of an April evening, Pearl and Roscoe stood at the edge of the churchyard near the oak trees, and he said very quietly, "I want to take you back to the church where we met." She looked at him. "You mean the one where your father—" "Yes." He paused. "I know it's a strange thing, but I keep thinking about that morning. How I walked in there expecting to be entirely alone in something, and then you sat down, and everything that came from that." He looked at the little church with the lopsided steeple. "I thought we could walk over there, together. Start from the right place, now that we know it was the right place." Pearl considered him for a moment, this serious, plain-spoken man who occasionally, when she least expected it, produced something so unexpectedly right that it rearranged everything. "I'd like that very much," she said. They walked together the 2 blocks to the First Methodist Church in the soft April evening and went inside. It was empty and quiet, the pews still holding the shadows of the morning's congregation. They went to the back pew where they had sat on the morning of his father's funeral, Pearl on the left, Roscoe on the right, exactly as they had been. They sat there together in the quiet church, and Pearl thought about James Monroe, who had built the ranch from a quarter-section claim and raised his son alone and died in October, and did not know that his funeral would be the meeting ground for something like this. She thought about Thomas, who had been a farmer who could fix anything broken, and about Mabel Greer, who had known her before, and about the stagecoach driver who had pointed her east on Cottonwood Road. She thought about all the specific, improbable mechanics of this moment, the accumulated machinery of grief and accident, and a widow who had sat in the wrong church and not left. "Thank you," she said. It was not directed at Roscoe, not entirely. He seemed to understand that because he simply took her hand and held it, and they sat for a while in the church where they had first met, together in the silence that was one of the things she loved best about him. The first year of their marriage was full and real in all the ways that first years are, the practical adjustment of 2 people learning to share a space and a life, the small negotiations and accommodations, the unexpected discoveries of habit and preference that only reveal themselves in daily proximity. Pearl moved her things from Mrs. Hatch's boarding house to the ranch house in a wagon that Roscoe drove himself, and she arranged the main room with the particular combination of her things and his things that created something new. Her mother's quilt on the settee, Thomas's pocket watch on the mantelpiece, alongside Eleanor's oval photograph, because she believed there was enough room in a life and a home for all of the people who had shaped it. She and Clara worked out the domestic rhythm of the household with mutual respect and considerable goodwill. Clara was not displaced. Pearl would not have wanted that, and she made it clear from the beginning. But their roles evolved naturally over the months, Clara managing the cooking and the deeper cleaning while Pearl took over the accounts and the garden and the chickens, and they worked beside each other with a comfortable ease that had developed into genuine friendship by the following spring. Pearl took to ranch life with more enthusiasm than she had expected, and with a physical capability that surprised Roscoe and pleased him obviously. She was not delicate. She had grown up in Missouri and farmed in Kansas, and was not frightened of hard work or outdoor life. She learned the cattle, learned the seasons of the ranch, learned the specific geography of the land that was now hers, and found in that learning a satisfaction that she had not realized she was missing in the seamstress work and the account books. She still worked at Finney's 3 days a week, because she wanted to and because Mr. Finney needed her, and Harlow Creek remained the social world that she had been building since November, a place where she had friends and a role, and a sense of belonging that had been genuinely earned rather than inherited. She wrote to Sarah Coombs every month, and Sarah came to visit in August 1883, arriving on the stagecoach from Caldwell with 2 carpet bags, and the unconstrained delight of a woman who is visiting her best friend for the first time in her new life. Sarah sat on the porch with Pearl in the summer evening and looked at the land and the house and Roscoe, who was visible in the distance working with the horses, and said, "Oh, Pearl." This is exactly right, with such simple conviction that Pearl felt tears rise unexpectedly and let them. By the autumn of 1883, Pearl knew she was expecting a child. She told Roscoe on the evening of the first anniversary of his father's death, the 14th of October, which had become a day they observed quietly each year, going together to the churchyard in the evening where James Monroe was buried, sitting there for a while with the things that needed to be said in the presence of that grave. She had not planned to tell him that particular evening. But they were walking back from the churchyard in the October dusk, and he was talking about his father in the open, unguarded way he had developed over the past year. No longer just the composed public narrative of a man managing his grief, but the real memory, the actual man, and she felt the news rise in her and understood it was time. She said, "Roscoe." He looked at her. "We're going to have a child," she said. The October evening was very still around them, and the cottonwood trees were beginning their annual gold, and Roscoe Monroe stood on the road outside Harlow Creek and looked at his wife with an expression that went through several things rapidly: shock, and then the specific, complex emotion of someone who has waited for something and feared to wait too long and then found it, and she watched him find his way to joy. "When?" he said. His voice was rough. "March, I think. Dr. Abernethy agrees." He took her face in his hands, those broad, work-scarred hands, so carefully held her face, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. "I thought about this," he said. "I thought about it when he started again. "I want you to be safe, I want you to be well." "I am well," Pearl said. "I am completely well." She held his wrists gently. "Dr. Abernethy says there's every reason to expect it will be straightforward." She looked at him steadily. "I am not going to leave you, Roscoe, I promise you that." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, and the storm had passed to something clear and deep and full. "I'm very happy," he said. "I'm the happiest I have been in a very long time." "Good," Pearl said simply. "So am I." The winter of 1883 to 1884 passed in the particular warmth of a pregnancy, the household rearranging itself around the coming addition. Clara was quietly and completely delighted, and began knitting things without announcing them, small garments appearing folded on the kitchen table. Hank and Dorothy wrote from California with equal delight, Dorothy reporting that they were also expecting, and that perhaps the children would know each other as cousins, which made Pearl laugh with pleasure. Agnes Hartwell came out to the ranch twice a month through the winter with what she described as various errands, but what was transparently concern and care. And Pearl received each visit warmly, because she understood by now that this was simply how Agnes loved, and it was a privilege to be included in the circle of people Agnes Hartwell loved. Mrs. Hatch organized what Pearl's time in Caldwell would have called a baby shower, though the term was not widely in use in 1884 Texas. A gathering of the women of Harlow Creek at the boarding house on a February afternoon, with gifts and conversation, and the specific, ancient solidarity of women accompanying one of their number through the approach of birth. The baby came in March, as the doctor had predicted, on a Tuesday evening when the Texas spring was beginning, and the bluebonnets were pushing up through the pale grass of the south pasture, where Pearl could see them from the bedroom window. It was a boy, a large, loud, immediately enthusiastic boy with Roscoe's dark hair, and as Roscoe said in a voice that was not entirely steady, Pearl's eyes. They named him James Thomas Monroe, for both the fathers, and both names felt correct in the way that names sometimes feel correct before the person named has done anything to earn them. Clara wept without any attempt at concealment when she first held the baby, and Pearl let her hold him for a long while, and watched the older woman's face with a fullness of feeling that she thought was specific to this kind of moment, the feeling of a family completing itself. Roscoe held his son for the first time with the careful, reverent gravity of a large man, holding something he is simultaneously terrified of and undone by, and he sat in the chair by the bedroom fireplace with James Thomas Monroe in his arms, and he was quiet for a long time, and Pearl watched him from the bed, and thought about the morning of his father's funeral, and the hat turning in his hands, and the man who had looked like someone who needed another person in the room with them. He looked up at her eventually, and his gray-brown eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, a brightness without storm in it, clear all the way through. "Thank you," he said, "for walking into the wrong church." Pearl laughed, really laughed, the full and unguarded laugh that had been one of the first things he had told her shyly that he loved about her. "I'm very glad I got the directions wrong," she said. "I've been thinking," he said, looking back at the small, sleeping face of his son. "We should go tell my father." He glanced up. "At the grave, when you're well enough. I think he would want to know." Pearl felt something that was not grief and was not happiness, but occupied the territory between them where the truest feelings lived. "I think so too," she said. They went on an April morning, Pearl and Roscoe, carrying James Thomas in the crook of Roscoe's arm, to the churchyard of the First Methodist Church, where James Monroe was buried under a good stone that bore his dates and the words "a man of this land." They stood there together in the April sunlight, and Roscoe talked to his father in the low, plain voice he used for the most important things, and Pearl held his free hand and looked at the stone and thought about all the people who were gathered here in this moment, present in different ways: James Monroe, and Thomas Talbot, and Eleanor Monroe, and Mabel Greer, and all the accumulated weight of what had been lived and lost and loved. The cottonwood trees above the churchyard were coming into their new green, and the bluebonnets had spread themselves across the Texas hillside in a blue that was almost too vivid to be real, and the baby in Roscoe's arm woke and looked at the sky with the earnest, puzzled concentration of a person who has just arrived and is trying to understand everything at once. "He's doing what you do," Pearl said. Roscoe looked at her. "What do I do?" "Look at things until you understand them." He was quiet for a moment, and then the smile came, the full one, the rare and genuine one, and Pearl thought, as she had thought before and would think again for the rest of her life, that this was exactly right. This was the life, the specific, particular, improbable life that had come from a wrong turn and a widow who had stayed when she should have left, and it was full and warm and real in every direction. They walked home together in the April morning, the three of them, through the town that was hers now, past the two churches, past Finney's General Store, down Cottonwood Road toward the Monroe Ranch where Clara was already making something good for breakfast, and the Hereford cattle were moving through the spring grass in the south pasture, and the creek was running clear over limestone. And the story was not over. Stories never are. They only arrive at the good parts and pause to breathe. There would be more years, and more children. A girl they would name Eleanor Clara Monroe 2 years later, fierce and dark-haired and immediately very clear about what she wanted, followed by a second boy they called John, and eventually a third, small and blonde and inexplicably resembling nobody on either side, who they named Will. And would there be hard things too? Because life did not stop being life, and the land was demanding, and the winters were real, and the world had its injustices. Particularly for the communities Pearl came to know better as her years in Texas deepened. The Mexican families who had been on this land before the Anglo settlers, and who navigated a system that did not honor their history, the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had been pushed from their territories in the preceding decades in ways that had been brutal and wrong. All of this a shadow over the landscape that honest people acknowledged even when they could not fix it. And Roscoe and Pearl were honest people who taught their children to see the whole of the world they lived in, not the comfortable edited version. But through all of it, the foundation held. The foundation was them. The specific, particular, deeply unlikely them. A widow who had gone to the wrong funeral and stayed because she recognized suffering and could not walk away from it. And a rancher who had been sitting alone in his grief and had found, without looking for it, someone sitting beside him. They built the life on that. On the truth that had been in it from the beginning. That kindness and presence and the willingness to stay were not nothing, were in fact everything, were the entire substance of what it meant to love a person. On an evening in the October of 1898, years after the morning it had all begun, Pearl sat on the porch of the Monroe Ranch house, with the sunset going gold and pink over the Texas hills, and Roscoe came out from inside and sat beside her in the other chair, and they could hear the children inside being noisy with Clara, who had the patience of someone who had been waiting for this particular noise for a very long time. "James is asking about the church story again," Roscoe said. "He asks every week," Pearl said. "What did you tell him this time?" Pearl thought about it for a moment. "I told him that his grandfather had a funeral in October and a widow walked into the wrong church and sat beside his father and neither of them left alone that day, and that everything good in his life came from that morning." She paused. "He said it sounded like something a preacher made up." Roscoe laughed. The full sound of it went out over the ranchland in the evening air. "He's going to be trouble," he said. "He takes after you," Pearl said. "He takes after you," Roscoe said. "I never walk into the wrong church." "No," Pearl agreed, "but you were very glad when someone else did." He reached over and took her hand on the armrest between their chairs. The easy, habitual, deliberate gesture of a man who has been reaching for the same hand for 8 years and intends to reach for it for considerably longer. And the sun went down over the Texas hills in shades of gold and deep red, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the children were loud inside the house, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone golden again for autumn, the way they did every year, the way they would do long after. Pearl Talbot Monroe sat with her husband's hand in hers and the evening coming on warm and full around her, and thought that there was no arithmetic for this, no accounting. There was only the fact of it, the enormous, simple, irreducible fact of a life that was whole.